Guruve Gaurachandraya Radhikaya Tadalaye Krishnaya Krishna Bhaktaya Tadabhaktaya Namo Namaha Panchakalpatrubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Bhaivacha Patitanam Bhavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Dhanavad devotees. I've gotten more questions that are coming in, and I'm trying to keep up with the questions and answers as usual. I'm also reaching out to one God brother, Maharaja. So I will get to the question or maybe elucidation on the topic that we talked about in upcoming Facebook Live. I think that subject probably takes more more details, so it may be a little longer. So perhaps within the next week or so, I'll try to do that, to look at the verse that we talked about, and also in relation to Chatte Shloke Bhagavatam. So hopefully we'll get to do that, and maybe I'll have the benefit of many senior devotees giving insights, and I'll also be greatly benefited by just putting the subject matter out and having it discussed. So today I'm answering a question regarding someone who spoke about bhakti and suffering. So it was a pretty protracted question, as most of them are. And so I just want to kind of talk about that subject a little bit. What is the nature of bhakti and suffering? And how do we understand it? And because it is mentioned that there is even suffering for those who are in the Leela of Bhagavan, like eternal associates. And what I guess she meant by that was that the suffering in the mood of separation of gopis, the suffering that was undergone by the Panch Pandavas, even she brought up in the context that apparently Bhagavan himself, as far as the suffering of the abduction of Sita, and then Sita suffering at behest of being kidnapped by Ravan. And of course, there's many subtleties and nuances to all these things, but the concept I understood, and I thought it was a very good question, that how do we understand suffering in relationship to bhakti? So I think first we have to start at the level of the conditioned souls. And how do we understand suffering, and then how do we understand suffering in relation to the practice of bhakti? So in the relationship of the jivas to the material world, Jiva Goswami Pad has explained in Paramatma Sandarbha, when he was giving the 21 qualities of the Atma, he mentioned one of those qualities to be Chit Ananda Atmaka. So Chit Ananda Atmaka means that, in his own words, that the Atma is Dukkha Pratyogita. So Dukkha Pratyogita means that in the Atma itself, in the soul itself, there is no dukkha, there is no suffering. So suffering is not something that is generated from within the actual soul or within the Atma. So where does suffering then come from? So the soul itself, or the Atma, seated in its own position. What is this? Eka Rupa Swarupa Bhak. This is another description of Jiva Goswami. The soul is always actually situated in its own nature. So then how is it possible, if it is situated in its own nature, and by that nature it has no suffering, how is it experiencing suffering? So this is the amazing relationship between the material energy and the jiva. And it's expressed somewhat in the Bhagavad Gita verse, Apariyamadastuanyam prakritim vidime param Jiva Bhuta Mahabaho Yayedam Daryate Jagat. That the jivas, even though they are part of the superior energy of Bhagavan, right? still they have a connection with the material world. And by the nature of that connection, they are struggling with the material energy. So how do we understand this connection? First, we should understand that the Upanishads mention asanga hi anyam purushaha, that the jivas do not actually touch the material energy, either the gross or subtle forms of the material energy. So the connection is certainly not one of actual contact or any kind of actual synthesis. Rather, the connection must be coming from somewhere else. So now, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, when he was asked the very nature of this question by Srila Sanatana Goswami Pad, Keami, Kene amai, Jare Tapatrai. First he asked Mahaprabhu, Keami, who am I? And Kene amai, Tare Japatrai. Why am I suffering miseries? So this was the perfect questions that deal with this subject matter. Mahaprabhu, of course, answered, Jiver Swarup, Oye, Krishna Nitya Das. Your actual identity is that you are the Das of Krishna, right? This is your constitutional reality, that you are Dasosmi. You are the Das of Krishna. He did not mention any specificity to this Dasitva. He only mentioned constitutionally, we are all the servants of Krishna. Also, a similar verse to that is Dasabhuti Hariyeva, right? That everyone certainly constitutionally is a servant of Krishna. Now, he then goes on to say, Jivera Tatasta Shakti Bera Be Prakash. But the jivas are a potency of Bhagavan, which is called Tatashta Shakti. So the word Tatashta means to be situated in a marginal position. This marginal position is not an actual place or a physical manifestation. It is actually a swabhav. It means it's a nature. So the nature of the Atma is to be situated in a position that has a marginal relationship with the internal energy and the external energy. What I mean by that is that it is situated in a position where it can be influenced by either one. For the jivas who are influenced by the external energy, the feature of avidya becomes the prabhav, becomes the energy that is exerted on those conditioned jivas. So what is the meaning here? That avidya has components. The first component of avidya is called avidya itself, which means avidya, not having vidya or not having knowledge of one's own nature and one's own identity. That is called avidya. Then there's asmita. In the absence of having knowledge about our actual identity and our actual nature, doesn't remove the fact that we are somebody and we do have a nature. So the influence of ignorance then offers up a idea, asmita, I am somebody, right, other than who I actually am. And then, I mentioned this yesterday, the ahamkara is a particular feature of the three modes of material nature that also exert influence on the Atma and make the Atma think. Aham, I am the karana, the cause, and karata, doer of activities in relationship to this false identity. So Bhagavad Gita also expresses this. Prakriti kriya monani gunai karmani savasha ahamkara vimudatma kartamiti manyate. The living entity thinks himself to be the doer and cause of activities that are actually in fact carried out by the influence of the three modes of material nature. So now this ahamkara is the constituent part of the subtle body, right? The mental function, manas, and the intellectual function, buddhi. And then ahamkara is the false egoism, right? Because asmita, I have to be somebody. So now ahamkara comes in and solidifies the idea that we have this false sense of being the doer and the cause of everything in relationship to ourselves, when in fact the influence is coming from the three modes of material nature. Now, with those things intact, the living entity has been taking birth from one life to another, right, with the subtle body carrying all of those impressions and all of those misunderstandings and everything. And in each iteration, each successive birth, they get a particular upadi. Upadi means a designation, right? So the designation in one life may be I'm John Doe, born to Sally and George Doe, and I'm born in this place, in this race, etc., etc., etc. Right? So that's called an upadi. And now with that designation, which is backed by false ego, I'm now accepted a vicarious relationship with the material world from the position of the Atma. In other words, from my actual position, I've now created a vicarious identification with the external energy and the external manifestations of the three modes of material nature. So for analogy's sake, and I've given this so many times, the example would be that the Atma is seated like in a theater, and the Chitta, or the expanse of consciousness, is like a giant flat screen TV. And the Atma, or the soul, looking at this flat screen TV, is impressed with the idea that I'm part of a drama that's being played out by the three modes of material nature productions. So the three modes of material nature are providing, according to my karma, a particular movie. And I'm looking at that movie, and the vicarious identification is so strong that one of those 5 features of ignorance is called abhinivesh. Abhinivesh means an absorption that is inextricable. So in other words, the Atma now has this vicarious identification with the drama being played out by the three modes of material nature in combination with our karma. And we are strongly identifying with it. And in that identification, because it's not real, a duality arises. This duality are the last 2 features of avidya, which is called rag and dvesh. Right? So let me repeat the features of ignorance. Avidya itself, asmita, rag, dvesh, and abhinivesh. These are the 5 features of ignorance. Right? So I've already explained abhinivesh, which is an inextricable absorption in this drama that we're witnessing from the position of the soul that's being manufactured by the material energy and the three modes of material nature. Rag and dvesh are the duality that arises of acceptance and rejection of various phenomena that's coming within that drama or that movie being projected by the material energy. So what happens is that from previous impressions and previous samskars, they call it, previous impressions, the mental and intellectual function takes a particular situation, dynamic, or something within the material energy and says the intelligence pulls it from various impressions, it manifests on the mental platform and says, yes, remember, this feels good. We should accept it. And the mind then says, yes, it feels good, and accepts it. And then vicariously, the soul experiences whatever kind of nuance or whatever kind of emotional state exists with that acceptance of that thing. Then other things come up, and the intellectual facility says, yeah, this thing was not so good. Then the mind says, no, that doesn't feel good. That wasn't a good experience. So then the mind rejects it, because the mind only has those 2 functions, acceptance and rejection. The intellectual capacity, buddhi, is the one that filters through all the previous impressions, takes the current impression and synthesizes it and says whether it's good or bad, presents it on the platform of the mind then accepts or rejects it. The soul is the witness. Sakshitva means like a witness. And it identifies with it and then goes through the emotional states in relation to whatever that particular thing is. So that is the science of what's happening. The soul is not actually in the material world, touching the material world. And don't mistake this, I'm also not espousing the idea it's somewhere like in the spiritual world looking at this. No, it is in its own nature, ekarupa swarupa bhak, but by the influence of avidya, it's having this experience. So now, based on that, there are, within the three modes of material nature, things that produce various kinds of suffering. Adhyatmic suffering, which means sufferings born from one's own temporal condition of their body and mind. Adibautic sufferings, those sufferings which come from interaction with other individuals and other living entities. And adidaivic sufferings, those sufferings that come about from the nature of the material energy itself. So suffering is actually inherent in the material energy. It's not in the Atma, it's not in the Jiva. It's in the material energy, right? Dukkalyam ashashrutam. The nature of the material energy is that it has dukh and also it's temporal. So now, by vicarious identification, we're having that experience, but the suffering itself is not in the Atma, it's in the vicarious identification with it. It's actually in the three modes of material nature or within material energy. It's not in the Atma, right? So by vicarious identification, we experience it. So from the material point of view, part of the objective, especially when one first comes to bhakti, is that one wants to remove that vicarious identification. The only way to remove that vicarious identification is to establish the real identity and real nature of the Atma. When we take up the practice of bhakti, then the first thing that comes is a sense of faith in the idea that I am not this temporal karmic portfolio. I am something else. And that gives rise to something which is called mati. Mati means a kind of discrimination, and it's encapsulated very well in the question of Sanatana Goswami to Mahaprabhu. Who am I and why am I suffering? When that question arises in the jiva, this state is called mati. This state of mati gives rise to the idea of the investment of the currency called faith in a search for that truth about who I am and why I'm suffering and what is my real status, etc. So that thin, it's called Komal Shraddha, that thin line of faith becomes a currency by which we start to shift away from the vicarious identification with the external energy, and we start to look for the alternative. Now, there are only two energies, right, that are there. Well, the third one is the jiva itself, but the external energy, so the alternative search starts to take place in the internal energy. So we start turning towards the internal energy. This is called Bhakti Unmukh, right? To start to turn towards Bhakti. Up to this point, from time without any beginning, we have been Bahirmukh, turned away. We've been facing the external energy and identifying with it. But now, by mati, that discriminatory consideration comes in and we break that connection with the external identification and start to look for the alternative at the internal energy. So this is called Shraddha Anupayani Rajam Bhakti Unmukhi Chitta Vritti Visesh. Understand? So now, by this faith currency, we start to become Bhakti Unmukh, Chitta Vritti. The functions of the chitta, that subtle sheet of consciousness, the flat screen TV, turns off the movie of the external energy, or at least in the very beginning, doesn't turn it off completely, but it kind of looks for alternative channels. And listen, this can't be the only channel in town. And so now we start to look for the internal energy, or towards the internal energy. At that point, it is the beginning of the dissipation of the suffering within the material world, because now we're breaking the vicarious identification with the material world. Now, as we begin to unfold in that process of turning towards the internal energy, there is some suffering that goes on there as well. Why? Because it's not there's kind of two methods. I'm trying to think of an example. When you have a Band-Aid on your hand, especially if you have a hair on your body, right? You can either peel off the Band-Aid, and as you peel it off, obviously it pulls on the hairs and it causes some discomfort. So there's some people say, listen, don't peel it off, just rip it off, right? It's still some kind of pain goes on, some kind of discomfort goes on, whether you peel it back slowly or whether you rip it off, that discomfort is unavoidable. In the same way, as you turn away from the external energy towards the internal energy, there is some pulling of the Band-Aid. And so there is some suffering which is inherent in the process of transition. Our Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur Pad, in his book or Grantha Madhurya Kandambini, has gone through the nature of that Band-Aid pulling process. And he's described 27 different things which constitute that shift. 6 kinds of anistita bhakti, means 6 kinds of unsteady bhakti. Right? Like Utsamai, Ganatarlana, Vyudavikalpa, etc. Then he describes 4 types of 4 anarthas. Then he describes 5 types of subtle mental influences that come when we attempt to do bhajan life, like loy, vikshepa, pratipatti, koshaya, and rasaswad. Right? So 4 times 4 is 16, 6 things that are there, that's 22, and then the 5 things that I mentioned that attack the mental faculties when we're trying to do bhajan make 27 things altogether. This is that Band-Aid pulling process where devotees go through various states of highs and lows, like Vyudavikalpa, like Mai and Ganataralala, right? So it goes through, we're going through that process of ripping off the Band-Aid or pulling it off slowly, but that also causes some apparent suffering. Because sometimes states of confusion will come up, sometimes we will not be enthusiastic, sometimes we'll be super enthusiastic. So that process itself has some degree of suffering in it, right? Now, the difference is because that suffering is in the mode of the healing of the jiva, it is accepted as a good kind of suffering. There is some pain involved. Like if anybody has an injury and they break an arm. Well, there's a very painful part of healing a broken arm, which is resetting it, right? I know during my athletic days and playing sports, if you got like a separated shoulder or something, it was very painful. But a great part of pain would also come in the healing process when they tried to realign your shoulder or something. It was extremely painful, right? So in the same way, as we're beginning to heal and break away from the influence of the external energy, there is some pain and suffering which appears within the course of that activity. Now, we codify that kind of suffering as the same kind of suffering that takes place during the healing process. Right? And our Rupa Goswami Upadeshamrita has described it as the condition of avidya. When you're in avidya, it is like jaundice. And the medicine for jaundice is rock candy. As you first begin to taste the rock candy, it is extremely bitter, and therefore it's not pleasing. But as you go on taking that medicinal rock candy, gradually, the sense of taste comes back because the body is healing. And then gradually you're able to taste the actual nature of the rock candy, which is extremely sweet, right? It's the most condensed form of sweetness is rock candy, right? So in the same way, by the process, which initially starts out where there is some suffering and some difficulty, just like the example of jaundice and sugar candy, gradually as we go on practicing, and it means practicing with sincerity, with saranagati, with proper guidance, everything, then gradually, the sweetness of the process arises. And when the sweetness of the process arises, and this stage is called ruchi, and we're able to sufficiently taste that sweetness, it is the symptom that our spiritual status is becoming fully healed, right? Especially in nishta and in ruchi, right? So first let me explain the different levels because that'll be helpful. So first there's shraddha, which I just spoke about, faith or faith currency. That faith matures over the course of time of practice. And as it matures, it manifests various levels of unfoldment. The first level of unfoldment that it manifests is the appreciation of what is sadhu sangha, right? So from that initial investment of faith, the association of devotees, especially sadhus. And Jiva Goswami Pad has described who is a sadhu. Sadnoti sadayati cha Krishna premiti sadhu. That person who's realized Krishna prem and realized the ultimate goal of life, right, is Krishna prem, he is called or she is called sadhu, right? Having the association of that kind of person, right, then gradually under their guidance, we perform the activities of developing our bhakti, right? That is called bhajana kriya, right? They give instructions how to do bhajan, right? And bhajan means the practices of bhakti, the external practices, sadhana, right? The rising during the early part of the morning Brahma Muhurta hours, performing Guru Pranam, performing the Mangalarati, chanting japa, chanting the Guru given mantras, etc. All of these external practices, but backed by the internal sentiment of Saranagati and the depth of the internal moods which are related to those things. Which means you need to have understanding of the artha or meaning of the things that you're doing. When there's a synthesis of meaning, understanding, and application, this produces bhajan, right? So then bhajan, by its prabhav, by its influence, it starts to remove the anarthas. Anarthas are those 27 things that I mentioned, right? I'm putting them all together. The first 6 things are called anistita bhakti. The second 4 types of 4 things, right, are called anarthas, right? And then the other things are called mental distractions, like loy, vikshepa, pratipatti, etc., right? But I'm grouping them together in 27, but the influence of your bhajan starts to remove those things. And as those things are removed, the crystallization of the actual internal energy starts to take place. So after bhajan, kriya, anarthas being removed by the influence of bhajan, then we come to the platform of nishta. So nishta means nishta, nischalaya, yasya, iti nishta. So it means the place where the heart or the chitta has become fixed. Another description is that it has become crystal-like in the fact that it is very clear. It is not being dominated by the influence of the material energy anymore. So now the nature of the spiritual energy or Swarup Shakti has the ability to reflect on the chitta. And when that Swarup Shakti begins to reflect on the chitta, first as an abhas, as a sort of reflection, right? Or sort of like a impression on the chitta, then it gives rise to what is called ruchi. And this is expressed in one verse. Tat tat bhava adi madhure shruti pekshate nasa sastana yuktingscha tal lobat utpati lakshanam. So the word lobat here means lobe or transcendental greed. So now in this stage of ruchi, an actual greed, an actual unshakable enthusiasm comes to reach the goal of this practice of bhakti, right? Which is loving service to Shri Radha Krishna Yugal or to Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So this lobe comes in the stage of ruchi. So what is the difference between this lobe or this greed and our initial interest in bhakti? In this lobe, it does not require to be vetted or validated by intellectual or philosophical understanding. Nasa sastra yuktingscha. So it's not dependent. It doesn't mean it's void of sastric understanding. It means it's not dependent on sastric understanding. Let me give an example. I always use the example that if you know how to make halava, that you need farina, you need butter, you need whatever additive you want to put, blueberries, strawberries, bananas, whatever kind of halava you want to make. You need water being boiled. You need a sweetener, right? So all of these are the ingredients. And then there's the process. Well, you should stir the grains for so many minutes till they turn a golden brown. You have to bring the water to a boil, adding the sweetener there. So all of these different ingredients regarding knowledge of how to make halava, right, is one thing. But if you didn't know any of these things and you sat down and somebody served you halava, when you took your first bite of that halava and the warm, sweet, fragrant, right? I don't want to make everybody hungry here early in the morning, right? But that taste of halava itself is an experience that doesn't require knowledge of how it was made. This was what happens in the stage of ruchi. So when you will read any Leelas of Bhagavan, you read Krishna Leela, any Leelas of Mahaprabhu, then a taste automatically is generated in the chitta, and it doesn't require being vetted by any kind of sastra or sastra yukti. Sastra yukti means any kind of logic or philosophical understanding regarding sastra. But again, don't get this confused. It doesn't mean it is void of sastra. It means sastra is there as a foundation, but it's not there as, and just like if you're eating halava. And as you're eating the halava, somebody comes and wants to query you about how it's made. Well, at the time of your tasting and experiencing the joy of eating the halava, that's not the most prominent thing on your mind. So it doesn't remove the idea of how halava is made. It just makes that at that time of tasting it, that's not most prominent on your mind. So in the same way, when you are hearing Gaur Lila, hearing Krishna Lila, and you've come to the stage of ruchi, the lobe, the transcendent greed that's in the heart becomes the prominent thing, and there's a very wonderful taste which is coming by hearing that Harikatha. Understand? There's a wonderful experience that's coming from hearing that Harikatha. And therefore it's not dependent on logic and reasoning and how this happens, right? So this is the first level of ruchi, right? The second level of ruchi is described. Tasya tadrasa sudakarakabasa samula sita ridoya swati kamani sastrari shruteshu ragatmakaya bhakti paripattishu api ruchi jayate. So the second part is described that as we mature in the level of ruchi, right, then sudakarakabas, the particular mood of a particular associate in the spiritual realm reflects on the chitta. It becomes an abhas, a reflection on the chitta. When that happens, a samulasita means, and ulas means like an exaltation, a wondrous feeling takes place in your chitta. I want to serve Krishna like that associate. You understand? I want to serve Krishna like that associate. Right? And because the heart has now become clear, Hridoya Spatikamani. Spatikamani means like a crystal. So the heart's become like a crystal, so the rays of the kind of love of that associate is reflecting in your heart and giving rise to a desire. Api ruchi jayate, the upsurge of a desire to serve like that associate. Ragatmakaya bhakti. So when you sastradi shruteshu. So when you hear pastimes and that associate and their particular type of service comes up, it gives ulas in your own chitta and gives you the desire to want to serve like that. That's the second level of ruchi. Understand? So I don't want to get too far away from the subject of suffering, but I want to give a description so we can understand the unfoldment in bhakti, and particularly understand how even at the beginning of that unfoldment, there is some suffering. Right? So let me not go any further, because as we go further into a sakti, etc., it becomes deeper. Right? But just briefly, that ruchi then takes on the position. There's two kinds of ruchi. One is ruchi in the practice itself, meaning a taste arises in the practice of bhakti, because it's by this practice that these feelings have evolved. So now a deep taste in chanting Harinam, in doing Hari Kirtan, in hearing Hari Katha, in doing Thakurji Seva, Guru Seva. Oh, such a taste comes in that. I cannot do without it. Right? So this is called the first level. And in that first level, two things will become prominent. Right? One is called Vastu Vaishishta Apekshaniya. It means in the beginning, I do these things, but I want them to have nice aesthetics to them. So in other words, if I'm doing kirtan, I want it to be very melodious, very beautiful. The madanga players and kartal players should all be nice in time, everything. When I do Thakurji's darshan, oh, it should be very beautiful. The dressing, the shringhar, the backdrop, everything should be very nice. So there's the application that the vastu means the substances that I'm that I'm doing my service with should have aesthetic pleasingness, if that's the right term. You understand? So this is called Vastu Vaishishta Apekshaniya. Means that I have some consideration about the nature of the quality of the substances that are part of my bhajan life. The more mature stage is called Vastu Vaishishta Anapekshaniya, where the nature of the bhav that's involved becomes more prominent than the external aesthetics of something. For instance, my hearing Hari Katha or hearing especially Hari Kirtan is not dependent on the sweetness of the melody of the Kirtaniya. It's not dependent on the expertise of the mridanga and kartal player. Hearing Hari Katha, it doesn't matter that the speaker doesn't know 10 different ways to recite the verse. It doesn't matter that their Sanskrit pronunciation is not excellent, because the mood of the Kirtaniya or the Harikatha speaker, who's also a Kirtaniya, actually, their mood is more important. You understand? And I will taste the reciprocation of what bhav they have in their heart. So this is called Vastu Vaishishta Anapekshaniya. It's not dependent on external qualities or aesthetics. It's strictly dependent on the internal bhav which is present there. Then after that, attachment comes to the object of your bhajan life and your sadhan life. And this is called attachment to or ruchi in bhajaniya. So ruchi in bhajaniya means taste in the object of my worship. This stage is called asakti, right? And from asakti, when Swarup Shakti will descend into the heart, it will crystallize everything. This is encapsulated in the verse Sudha Sattva Viseshatma Prem Suyang Sasamyabha Ruchi Vishchittamasanya Kiraso Babuchite. If I'll explain the verse, then this will be hours, right? So essentially it means Swarup Shakti descends onto the chitta, Avir Bhuya Manovrito, and becomes one with the chitta and the mental functions, and it takes them over, and it crystallizes your own identity, the identity of your relationship with Bhagavan, etc., etc. So I don't want to go down so far because, like I said, that's a whole class, and we'll lose our subject. We've already gone pretty far off the idea of just what is suffering in bhakti. So now that I've explained that, and my original point in explaining all of that was that in the beginning, before we get up to these kind of higher stages, there is a degree of suffering in the tearing off of the band-aid of our attachment to the external energy, right? But as we get past that, and a lot of devotees get caught in that phase, and it's very difficult for them. So sometimes devotees, when they get to that stage of the band-aid tearing, they go through the most deep struggles. First of all is, why am I suffering even after giving 5, 10, 15, 20 more years to this practice? Am I still not experiencing something? Am I still having external issues in my relationships, interpersonal, interpersonal? Why am I still, having doubts? Why is this? Why that? Why this? And being haunted by these kinds of doubts and being haunted by perhaps external things going on in their life, which produces some sense of suffering because there is still some portion of themselves that has vicarious identification with the external energy, because we still have a material body at this point and everything, then devotees undergo a great degree of suffering in many cases with that. Now, sometimes devotees have reached out, well, maybe let me try something else, right, besides bhakti, to address those periods of suffering while I'm unfolding in bhakti. But I've often spoken, in many cases, I think this is a wrong thing, right? And I don't mean wrong in the sense that if somebody desperately needs deep psychological help, or somebody needs, because they're in emotional crises, a particular type of help, that you should not seek that out. I'm not at all advocating that. What I'm saying is that if you've not gone to any extreme, right, because of your condition, then you should, rather than divesting faith from the process of bhakti, which is an absolute process, and depositing it or giving it to another modality, deepen your investment in bhakti. Right? Just like sometimes I don't know stock markets and all these things, but it's said that sometimes if you make an investment in something and that particular commodity or whatever it is you invested in has some fluctuation due to the very nature of the market, don't withdraw everything, but rather double down, stay with it, because, and of course this is only a simile, so don't take it literally, that particular thing, its potential will again start to manifest, right? So bhakti is absolute, unlike the stock market, which is relative. Bhakti is absolute. So if you double down your investment in bhakti, that period of, quote, suffering, right, will actually not only go away, but then these higher stages like ruchi, etc. will become manifest, and therefore your investment that you've put in over 5, 10, 15, 20, etc. years, right, will start to manifest, and now you'll begin to realize what truly is the value of what you've been given by our Srila Prabhupada, by our Guru Vargas, etc. You understand? Another thing, we need to understand, like I mentioned at the very beginning, that actually the Atma itself is never suffering. So to help us cope with this intermediate stage of going through bhakti, it's important to remember that. Actually, I am not suffering, right? Whatever suffering is there is present in the vicarious experience I'm having with the material world. It's not in me. So let me first crystallize that in my consciousness and utilize it as the foundation of not giving in to the suffering and therefore starting to make adjustments on the basis of I'm suffering, this is too much for me, etc., etc. Right? Secondly, in a deeper sense, now speaking to the latter part of this person's question, what about the suffering that appears to take place even in the spiritual world? Right? So, actually, is there suffering in the material world? In the spiritual world? If even the Atma does not actually undergo suffering, how can we say there's any kind of suffering in the spiritual world? But then, Mukunda, you'd have to explain what is the situation with the gopis, their deep moods of separation. If you read Hangsadutta, if you read in many of our Goswami Varga's literature, if you read the Rasa Panchadhyay, especially in Gopi Geet, etc., how much suffering the gopis were going through. If you read even the history of the Panch Pandavas and the trials and tribulations of their life, how they suffered, how Kunti suffered. What about in Ram Lila? Even in Ram Lila, what kind of suffering was there even for Bhagavan himself that Sita's kidnapped? So you look at all these things and wait a minute. The activities which apparently would be the genesis of suffering are certainly there. So how can we say there is no suffering in the spiritual world? You could just say, well, this is all a Leela. But that really does not explain it. It's a fact, but it doesn't really explain it. You could say, well, everything is just going on as a pastime, which is the same thing as saying it's a Leela, right? But what is actually happening? What's actually happening is that, first of all, of course, philosophically, we know that there is no suffering in the spiritual world because the spiritual world has no avidya or illusion. Therefore, there's no possibility that the byproducts of illusion or avidya could be in the spiritual world, like suffering. So what is actually going on? The moods that take place within the divine realm, especially in Vrindavan, right? The genesis of all of the moods that take place are variations, elevations, and transformations of love. And the very nature of love itself is the highest type of ananda. All the things I just previously described from the point of view of a sadhaka culminate in the stage of bhav. And I described that. Sudasattva Viseshatma Prem Siyangsa Samyabhav. Well, that bhav, when it crystallizes, after we give up this particular body, and we enter into any place where Krishna's Leela is going on within the Prakat universes, the manifest universes, it will become Vastu. Vastu city means it becomes a crystallized substantive reality. In that substantive reality of praying, because that bhav has now become praying, right? The chitta is completely melted and become one with the Swarup Shakti, and now it is manifest as prem. That prem itself has so many manifestations and nuances and transformations. Prem, sneha, man, pranaya, rag, anurag. Anurag has so many transformations. Mahabhav, Rud, Adirud, Modan, Mohan, and only in Radhika, Madanakya Mahabhav. So in the study of Ujjwal Nilamani, all these things are clearly laid out how prem is undergoing all these transformations. So the nature of the emotional states of the entities of the spiritual world, the residents of the spiritual world, is based on the transformations of this prem vastu. It is not a byproduct of false egoism, and therefore it does not produce suffering as we know it in the material world. The difficulty is we can't understand the varieties of these prem transformations because we've not experienced them. And our imagination and our intellectual capacity can't grasp it because it's not within the material realm. We can have some anubhuti, means realizations of it, as our bhakti matures. We can give some sastra artha, meaning from sastra of these things, like I just described prem and snehanman, etc. And if you go to Ujjwal Nilamani, each of these stages is described. But the actualized experience, that will only take place when we're in that position, right? So we can't understand what is the meaning of the suffering experienced by the gopis, which have given rise to the verses of Gopi Geet, right? Or expressions, atatite bhavam anikananam tritiyugayate tvam apashyatam. Not seeing Krishna's face when he goes for Gocharan, meaning he's taking the cows out, even for that short time, it becomes like yugas have passed. So what is that feeling? Right? So they're saying they're suffering, not seeing the face of Krishna. And only for that short time that he's gone for Gocharan. Right? And it seems like yugas have passed. Well, when you study Ujjwal Nilamani, this comes in Rudabhav. The feeling that one moment or 1 second is like a kalpa and vice versa. When they're in the association of Krishna, even one night of Brahma doing the Ras Leela dance seems like only a fraction of a moment. So these are all the transformations and all of the nuances and vrittis of prem and how it functions. Because we don't have that experience, we can't understand it, right? We have the expressions and we can digest something in our intellectual capacity from studying Sastra. But the actual realization of it comes according to the unfoldment of our bhakti. Understand? So, in the spiritual world, there is no actual suffering. Everything is different nuances of ananda. Now, the difficulty is when you hear the word bliss or ananda, oh, so is that just another kind of happiness? They're not really suffering? No, again, our imagination and our intelligence can't capture what that experience is. We can only know that it's certainly not the suffering that's born of avidya. And we can know something according to our own level of unfoldment, the nature of what kind of bliss that is. You understand? And of course, things have to be in context. So the suffering of the gopis in Gopi Geet, it fully manifests the nature of their unconditional love in the last verse of Gopi Geet. Yate sujata charanam burunam staneshu. This is the last verse of Gopi Geet. This verse is called the Vasikrita verse. It means the verse was so full in its expression of the nature of the unconditional love. Tasam avyabacha chori smaya manamukam bojam pitambara daraswagri sakshat manmat manmat. That it forced Krishna to reappear before them in exactly the mood they wanted to see him. You understand? So here, their deep separation, right, was because of their unconditional love and desire to please Krishna. So one thing we should know, suffering, let me conclude with this. Suffering is born of self-interest. And where there is no self-interest, there is no misery. And more than that, when there's only the interest for the service of Krishna, anya abhilasita sunyam gyanakarma narvitam anukulyena Krishna anusilanam bhakti uttama. only when there's exclusive desire to please Krishna, bliss is produced from that. When there's no self-interest, Atmananda may be produced. In other words, I'm not suffering because I have no interest in the material world. But when I have positive interest in the Anukul Seva of Krishna, it produces extreme bliss in varieties of ways. Right? So self-interest is the culprit here in causing misery. And in the spiritual realm, it's expressed especially about the gopis. Atma sukhe dukhe, na agopir nahi ka vichar. Krishna shuke kare, manochesta vyavyahar. That the gopis only have desire for Krishna's happiness. Krishna shuke, manochesta vyavyahar. All of their endeavors, their chesta, are for Krishna's happiness. And therefore they only experience bliss in various varieties. Various varieties. That didn't make sense. In different varieties. Right? So this is the nature of why, first of all, there's no suffering, but only bliss in the spiritual realm, even though there are elements which would seem to be the genesis of a kind of suffering. In the material world, if your significant other leaves you or breaks your heart or whatever, there's great suffering. That's because in the material world, kaitavam rahitam prema, right? Everyone's so-called love is really a kind of cheating because everyone has self-interest. I love you because it makes me happy. Right? You love me because it makes you happy. And we mutually agree to nourish each other's self-interest, and that's the nature of a relationship here. So if somebody violates that, it causes a great deal of pain because we're identifying with the false identities that made that connection possible, and therefore now we're suffering the consequence of that. So where there is no self-interest, there is no suffering. And where there's only interest in the service of Bhagavan, there is great bliss. So if you had to take a concluding statement, that would be it. Where there is self-interest, right, there is suffering. Where there's no self-interest, there's no suffering. And where there's only interest in the pleasure of Bhagavan, there's great bliss. So hopefully that answered Didi's question, the lady's question, and at the same time was able to expand on things and to give a little bit of insight into the nature of how spiritual emotions work and so forth and so on. So that should be a also very comforting thing for devotees in general, that whatever suffering that we find ourselves in as far as the material world is concerned is the degree to which we've invested self-interest in it, right? Another way of looking at it is how detached we are from the material world. And that detachment cannot come via suppression or any artificiality. It'll have to come from genuine attachment to the internal experience, right? Just like you take up interest in something, and as you take up interest in one thing, maybe other things which were not as important wane away. Naturally, when we all came to the practice of bhakti, we shed many previous habits and previous associations and everything else because they just were not compatible with the taste we were experiencing in bhakti. So it's very organic. It's not artificial that I'll have to try to become detached. So actually the word vairagya, which means attachment, the actual definition of this word is visesh anuraga. It means a particular deep attachment to something that gives rise to an organic detachment from something else. In the Bhagavad Gita, this is expressed, raso rajam raso piyasya param drishvanavartate. Right? When I'm tasting something superior, then inferior taste organically goes away. Right? So hopefully this was helpful to Didi. I think it was a very great question. She asked about suffering in general in bhakti, and even in the spiritual world. Seems to be suffering, and what's the difference? I hope I was able to answer it to some degree. Of course, as usual, I avail to senior devotees and all devotees actually to share insights and also to make any corrections for something I might have stated wrong, and I apologize for that. Anything that I have stated that is correct and inspiring is the kripa of my Guru Parapadma, Nityalila Parvishram Vishnu Para Paramahansa Sutara Sisiman, Srila Bhakti Vedanta Narayan Goswami Maharaj, and my entire Guru Varga, all those who have been Siksha Guru for me, and all good friends and devotees who are always encouraging and showing love and affection for me. If anything has been said wrong, it's of course coming from me alone and my inadequacy, and devotees certainly can correct that thing. Alright, my Dandavat Pranam, Vancha Kalpaturubhischa, Vipasindhuvevacha, Patitanam Pavanebhyo, Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha, Jai Radhe Radhe.